We have an extremely important panel. So we have Ms. Wenjing. So she is doctoral candidate, Department of Political Science, Carleton, University, Ottawa. And she would be speaking on domestic imperatives of China's zero COVID policy, the challenges of the great affairs of state. And then we have Dr. Rityusha Tiwary. She is assistant professor and honorary fellow, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. And Rityusha's topic is not given here. Perhaps Rityusha would be, telling the topic herself when called on to speak. Then we have Dr. Carleton, fellow Strategic Studies Program, Observer Research Foundation, Mumbai. And he would be talking about China's nationalism under Xi Jinping. And we have discussant Dr. Ryan Haas, his senior fellow, and Michelle H. Coast, chair in Foreign Policy Program, Chen Fu, and Yan, co-chair in Taiwan Studies, the Brooklyn Institute, Washington, D.C. A bit about the rules, of the session. I think they would be giving 20 minutes each to every speaker. And then Anushka, that she would be keeping the time and perhaps, telling the speaker that you have a certain minutes left. And 10 minutes for discussant Ryan Haas, and perhaps 20 minutes or 30 minutes, 20 perhaps for discussion in the Q&A. If there is some time, perhaps I will also make my observation. But to set the ball rolling, I think domestic governance in China. This is, of course, it's one of the aspects. It revolves around legitimizing and enduring CPC's rule, and of course, placing China at the center of global affairs is the ultimate, objective of this governance. And if we look through the domestic, political, and socioeconomic decisions that have been made during last 10 years of Xi's rule, especially in the last 6 years, I would say, so we may conclude that she has emulated Mao to become a populist, nationalist, strong leader domestically, and announcing the arrival of China as a global player externally. The former is mirrored by his people-oriented philosophy of development. In Chinese, they call it Yi Ren Wei Pen. The elevation of property, of course, is debatable again, as Premier Li Keqiang has questioned it. The internal circulation and advocacy for the so-called common prosperity, for the sake of which he doesn't shy away from cracking down on China's big tech and big bigs across various sectors, including the entertainment industry. This people-oriented approach also include the COVID handling or mishandling, as you may call it, of late in China, and lashing out countries like India, the US, and others for not being able to control the pandemic. My reaction to a picture in China, there was a post in Chinese. In fact, they have literally put the Chinese word and then translated it in English, 和中国点火 versus into 点火. It was China igniting fire versus India igniting fire. That the two pictures that China just posed and then posted on their social media. It led to deactivation of my WeChat account for a year. You want to imagine. In fact, I reacted to that. In fact, I told Chinese friends, are you sensible or so insensitive? So proper handling or mishandling of COVID is indeed a major test for China's system and governance, as it has been put himself by Xi Jinping himself. However, whether China has summed up its experience and drawn a lesson from it, it appears debatable, given the way pandemic was handled in Shanghai, Hainan, and now in Luting County of Sichuan, where a massive earthquake struck on 6 September 2022. And with this, the rise of little pinks in China could be said is another spin-off of the same policy, though sobered by pandemic and crackdown on their spiritual gurus such as Samanan and Liu Qingtong of Peking University just before the convening of 20th Party Congress. Externally, it resulted in the wolf warrior diplomacy. The too obvious to notice when Yang Jiechi told his counterpart in the US that the US isn't qualified to speak from a position of strength. 美国没有资格居高临下跟中国说话. While Xi Jinping and his persona is largely responsible for shaping the trajectory of China's foreign policy, however, the issues are structural as well. Hu Jintao's second term saw the visible policy shift, the perceived power shift, and China's breakthrough in some of the technologies and monopolization of supply chains could be cited as some, other reasons. And of course, this would be oversimplification of Xi's domestic, political, and socioeconomic policies, for the decision are multi-layered, multifaceted, and very, very complex. For example, it is also about the ultimate control of the party state on economic entities. For the economic reforms and liberalization have indeed breached party's ultimate control over the gun and its currency, yuan. I have witnessed during my China visit, after taking over the reign of the party, how she ordered the closures of PLA businesses across China, how the mega companies in China successfully controlled wealth of the nation, including the sensitive information technology, big data, so on and so forth. So moreover, it's not just about the tycoons, but it's also about whom they are loyal to. Essentially, the factional feud with the party, Jiangzheng faction, as we have been talking about quite often. And Xi Jinping is wary of these big tech involving in so-called financial coups, so 金融政变. No wonder Wall Street, that once scheduled China, has fallen with Xi Jinping, and many are calling NCCP. Jackie Dorsey, co-founder of Twitter, he has put his Twitter handle, including the investment tycoon Warren Buffett. We have witnessed the fear of IPO of Ant Group and CT listing in the US stocks, the dwindling economic output, partially owing to the lingering COVID restrictions that have resulted in the closure of 460,000 and medium enterprises in this year alone. And of course, the real estate and, other, you can say crises, they are very, very unprecedented. Therefore, there is a crisis, and the regime certainly feels weaker and insecure than it is perceived outside China. The same, I would say, have affected the tone and terror of China's foreign policy in these years. So with these words, I hope some of these are further expounded by the speakers. So may I have the honor to invite our first speaker of the session, Ms. Wenjing. Wenjing, over to you. So you have 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor. So let me share my screen first. Okay. Can you guys see it?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Let me, oops. Okay. Well, thank you very much. So I will begin my presentation right away. The title of my presentation is the domestic imperatives of the China's zero COVID policy, the challenge of the great affair of state, 国之大者. So my initial imperative puzzle came from questioning China's lockdown in the recent Omicron hit. As we know, the current Omicron variant is more contagious but less pathogenic than earlier variant. The country with high, how can I change it back? Okay. Okay.
I think we cannot see it. It's a blank.
Yes. Sorry. Okay. So maybe I was presenting this way then, because I have some notes.
Ma'am, would you like us to share your presentation?
Perhaps you can click there on the numbers, like 1, 2. Right now it is the second one, and then the third. You can click on the third slide, yes, and then it will be reflected. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. It's okay. Okay. As we all know that the current Omicron variant is more contagious, but pathogenic than the earlier variant. The countries with high rate of vaccination, such as the US and Canada, and the India have already started incrementally easing and removing virus restrictions. The whole world is suffering from the COVID fatigue and is striving to restore a normal social and business order. Meanwhile, various places in China, such as Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Beijing, have been putting a strict and rigid restrictions under the name of the dynamic zero policy, which effectively place the local population into the enforced confinement. Consequently, the economic activities in the region ceased. So why are both approaches such opposite? So that's naturally brought to my research question, which echoes the theme of this panel. What is the domestic imperatives of the Xi's zero COVID policy, despite the rest of the world can't wait to restore the pre-COVID normality, and how are these domestic imperatives affecting China's foreign policy and the international order? My initial arguments are simple. Xi's search for ontological security is the lead up to the 20th National Congress of the CPC, stretches the boundaries of the governments and of China's state capacity in ways which, rather than secure the region and the leadership of the party, may compromise it along with China's rise. So based on the Jennifer Mason, the ontological security can define as a security not of the body, but of the self, the subjective sense of who one is, which enable and motivates actions and choices. Compared to the realist deep insecure of a structure, uncertainty, and other states' intentions, the ontological security theorists focus on the state's insecure about its own dysfunctional identity and triggers anxiety or shame, as well as whether or other states have intentions to undermine their assured relationship. The realist objective of insecure is more concrete and tangible, whereas ontological security relatively more abstract and intangible, which consequently is more difficult to restore once states feel ontologically insecure. A cohesive and self-perception and recognition of others are two basic core components for questing ontological security. So my research has two theoretical dimensions based on these two core components, the biographical narratives and self-other relations. So biographical narratives, according to the Giddens, is a story by means of which self-identity is reflectively understood, both by individual concerned by others. At the same time, states need to ensure predictable, stable, and comprehensible relations with other states, especially its significant others, through routinized day-to-day interactions. This research will be conducted in a qualitative way. It relies on the first-hand and second-hand sources, such as governors, official speeches, and academic articles, and the think tank reports and newspaper pieces. And discourse analysis has also been applied. So I laid out like 3 stages of the COVID in China for better examination. As you can see, the CPC with Xi Jinping at its core is the main object of my research instead of China as a state. So I decided to do so is because the biographical narratives contains a 2-level consistency, namely the endogenous and the exogenous. So I argue that the inconsistency of the endogenous and the exogenous biographical narratives empowers Xi's ambitions to reach the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and the great affair of state. Ontological security literature has put more weight on the exogenous biographical narratives of national identity, but the endogenous storytellings cannot be simply dismissed. So endogenously, the consistency and coherence of the state's biographic narratives depends on the communication and the coordination between the elites and the people. The doubts and the droughts from the bottom up increase the risk of disagreement and lack of endorsement of its national identity. So as a result, the states often experience tremendous ontological insecurity from its own endogenous narrative adjustment, especially at a critical juncture in the domestic region transformation or unstable international milieu. And subsequently, ontological insecure states may experience a break in its previous coherent national identity, which may cause consequences in terms of a breakdown of the hard-earned trust from the international society or of a potential impact on the international order. Or since the very beginning, the core narrative of the CPC is to legitimize its COVID-19 response have never changed. As Xi states in the multiple occasions, the Chinese Communist Party has always put the people and lives and their health first. The people first narrative found that its mass line tactic that were initially developed by Mao during the Chinese Revolution. It is also an essential component of Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy. The greatness and assertiveness of the CPC's biographical narratives on China has been reactively under the first and second stage of the COVID because of the CPC's relatively successful COVID control. The CPC has made efforts to claim leadership in the fight against the COVID globally, especially at the second stage when the rest of the world are facing ever worsening waves of the pandemic concurrently. It has vigorously promoted the Health Silk Road, adapting the Belt and Road initiatives in an attempt to apply it to the global pandemic era. Several surveys also shows that the high level of the approval of the government's response to the pandemic, especially at the central government level. However, the restrictive expansion of the government's power and the restrictions of the citizens' personal freedom and of movement and freedom of expressions forced the masses to questioning the validity of its policy and even the authenticity of and purpose of the CPC's biographical narratives. However, the CPC has defended the zero COVID policy as the policy of the greater benevolence. The pandemic containment is a much greater priority than the economic development, as the economic cost of strict containment policies are short-term fluctuation and thus are acceptable. So in fact, the social contract of the CPC's authoritarian regime was based on the people's ceding their political rights in exchange for a certain amount of personal and economic freedom. However, the zero COVID policy has had a significant negative impact on the CPC's authority and prestige. Instead of responding to the complaints and the anger of the people, the CPC has intensified its policy in such a way that it is now act as a obstructive resistance to counter its own anxiety for its own ontological security. For example, there are further preventative internet regulations and passport control. As Yan Xuetong pointed out, if China is not able to align the value it promotes externally with the value it practices domestically, then it means that China cannot set international norm according to its value. So the inconsistency of the CPC's endogenous and exogenous biographical narratives that have an unsustainable social and economic cost, which potentially generate an impact globally. First of all, so the sudden halt of the world factory under the era of globalization intensified the global supply chain woes, the country's domestic economic decline, which is a result of the soaring debts and the exhaustion of the investment-driven development, and a fast aging population might amplify the negative efforts of the direct COVID shutdown on the Chinese economy. As a standard living stalls, the middle-class Chinese may turn against the party, although not in a way of a direct protest, could vote with its feet by immigrating abroad in a larger number. It is already happening since the Hong Kong and Shanghai lockdown began. The last generation and the wrong philosophy have become a hot topic among the middle-class Chinese after they witnessed the rigid confinement. And China will start a substantial population decline since 2040s, and in 2060s, the population decline will reach to 9 to 10 million per year, an annual growth rate of about -1%. Nearly 100,000 people immigrate in February and March 2022 since the Omicron hit Hong Kong, which is nearly tenfold of the same period of the last year. Meanwhile, around 13,000 high net worth individuals are seeking to leave China after facing a continued zero COVID enforcement, which could take 60 billion in wealth with them, according to Honorary and Partners report. I applied the Wen's conceptualization of the cultural anarchy, namely the Hobbesian enmity, the Lockean rivalry, and the Kantian friendship to the existing relations, self-other recognition. So I argue that the cooperative self-other relations between China and its significant other, the US, have started to transform from a systemic rivalry to an all-weather rivalry, which is getting closer to the confrontational Hobbesian enmity between China and the United States. So systemic rival refers rivalry and competition, and the systemic level, mainly political and economic, with the implication of the ideological confrontation and the value conflicts, but does not preclude cooperation based on the specific interests at other levels or areas, such as climate change, public health crisis, trade, and global governance, while all-weather rival implies a comprehensive and systemic competition, the confrontation and the conflicts with antagonism in all areas, and a step away from being enemies. So unlike European Union sees China as its systemic rival, the United States perceives China as its all-weather rival.
Within 5 minutes?
The nationalism can intimately link the chosen traumas and glories and then become a powerful identity signifier to the degradation of the significant other. It can also contribute to push the systemic rival to all-weather rival in a swift way when both sides mutually regard each other as their exogenous significant other. The China and the United States sees each other as their significant other, and China keep rising in power Xi's ambitions to transform the previous leader's notion of reciprocal cooperation with others that embracing a mutual benefited way of openness and participation to become an international rules maker that fulfill with confidence on China's competitiveness. And the CPC seeks expanding the boundaries and its core interests, leading the United States to view China as its strategic competitor and a revisionist, as well as a primary security threat that are challenging its rule-based international order. So COVID-19, as ought to be a non-conventional security issue, is not a zero-sum game due to its undifferentiated security threat. However, since the global pandemic starting early 2020, finger pointing and blaming one another have become a part of a routinized relations between China and the United States. From the China virus and the wet market distant to the lab leaking theory, the United States pinned China down as the one responsible for the global disaster. Meanwhile, the Chinese official and the news agency have pushed unfounded theories that the United States was the source of the virus after the condemning American officials for politicizing the pandemic. So during the first 2 years of the global pandemic, the CPC's zero COVID policy have proved to be more successful in containing the outbreak and the strategic adopted by the most of the other countries in the world. And Xi Jinping has a confident, have much more confident declaring that China is entering a period of opportunity when the East is rising and the West is declining. And Xi told his country colleagues that the United States is the biggest threat to our country's development and the security. Therefore, he calls for the fighting spirit to defend China's core interests to the Western world. Follow Xi's instructions, the wolf warrior diplomacy are applied. It in fact allows Chinese diplomats to appease home nationalists and uphold Xi's diplomacy while still giving the Chinese government the ability to control the escalation of disputed issues. The manifestation of the nationalism has effectively added glories and solidarity to the CPC's governments. In other words, the U.S., the failure of the U.S. at the domestic COVID control made Xi's rule even more successful and stable. However, those achievements were short-lived and have since had a dramatic shift since the Hong Kong and the Shanghai lockdown. This event came along with the turbulence global affairs namely the Russian invasions to Ukraine and the Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. Follow his success in dealing with the pandemic, she had further consolidated his control and decided to stick to the zero COVID policy by refusing to accept any criticism of China and his totalitarian leadership from any foreign countries or influential individuals. Even internal criticism have been labeled as collision with foreign forces. The ontological security spirals in a vicious circle at this critical moment when both China and both United and China are facing a critical political transitions in a turbulent world. As we all know that she's expected to continue his rule in a third term, and Biden is also facing the midterm election. So under such circumstances, the CPC has decided to keep beating the drums of the Chinese nationalism to counter any disdain to the zero COVID policy, especially targeted to the United States. However, unlike the previous time, it instead attracted the act of mocking and denouncing from its domestic audience. The Nancy Pelosi's visiting was further worsening CPC's face value, which intensifies CPC's ontological insecurity. In retaliation for the Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, Beijing cut off the vital US contact, which pushed the existing growing distrust to an unfavorable peak. The communication channel have been seriously deteriorated, and insecurity become a part of routinized relations is a sign for a further step into all-weather rivalry.
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt you. Could you please conclude in 2 minutes?
Yes, the revealing impact, as we can see, the strategic decoupling has been speeded up, and thanks to the COVID and the Russia's invasion to Ukraine, and there are constant discourse comeback between the China and the United States, and it is also on the brink of the military confrontation if the core interest clashes between these two nations, and the implications can be concluded as the China may potentially economically align with the Russia and other authoritarian regions. In other words, lock China's door against its rival in a new form of Cold War, and a weak China is maybe more warlike than a strong one. The strong man's illusion will give up all previous made achievements. So what Putin is doing now has rang the bell. But at the same time, it is the golden opportunity for India. Well, thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Wenjing, for your excellent presentation. I particularly like the way you put the concept of ontological security and further expounded it through endogenous and exogenous narratives, and finally, like how the Kantian cooperation, co-option, interdependence, or trust, it is gradually giving way to Hobbesian anonymity. So thank you very much. I hope there would be a lot of questions. We will reserve them for Q&A. So meanwhile, may I have the honor to invite our next speaker, Dr. Rityusha Tiwary. She will be speaking on Chinese state capitalism and global capital, locating domestic transformation and foreign policy readjustment. Rityusha, over to you. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. The title of my presentation is Chinese State Capitalism and Global Capital, Locating Domestic Transformations and Foreign Policy Readjustments. So the problematic is as follows. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Anushka. To understand the complex interlinkages of Chinese state capitalism, CSE henceforth, with global capital, that is GC. To explore the impact of CSE-GC interaction on China's domestic framework and foreign policy. And I have one major proposition, which I have tried to divide in 3 distinctive phases. That the emergent interlinkages of CSC-GC interaction can be traced through 3 distinct phases. 1, the transformation of state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and their emergent links with GC. 2, the rise of Sino-American animosity as a result of clash between CSC and US capitalism. And 3, the expansion of CSC through the Belt and Road Initiative and sub-regional linkages as responses to global capital, as well as its own internal transformation, including the BRI, as markers of foreign policy readjustments by the Chinese state. Next slide, please. Chinese state capitalism, CSC, the way it has evolved, it answers a lot of questions about the form it has taken today. And therefore, the interlinkages with global capital can be better understood if we kind of have an overview of the form that CSC has taken up. So in that, the major pointers are that the Chinese state has been rapidly changing, having adapted to globalization and market-oriented reforms. CSC represents entrepreneurship with the Chinese state, or more precisely, Communist Party of China as the guide. There is no singular state-firm relationship as it has evolved, because there are multiple versions depending on the nature of the business firms and also the role of the provinces. And in the previous session, the way provinces have started intervening in the entire structure of decision-making of the state was brought out very well. So that's one point where we can kind of come to a loose conclusion that there is no definitive form of CSC, which is therefore now emerging as a fragmented and often quite ambiguous form in terms of state business relations in international markets. There are differing rationales, interests, and policies driving the central government, the provincial governments, and the business community. And therefore, coordination across the wide area of governmental and corporate agencies is again very ambiguous, to the extent that the term state capitalism has now started being questioned. And some of the analysis are even calling it redundant or obsolete, given that there is a multiplicity of actors like the government, the party, and the private firms as actors in whole panning out of state-led capitalism. The transformation of CSC over the past decade has been very significant and represents a new paradigm or new capitalism. That's also one of the take that has come out in many studies. Next slide, please. CSC presents an intriguing picture of market and political power interaction. And if we were to take an example of that, the regulatory reform targeting China's most influential and well-known companies in terms of new data, security regulations, anti-monopoly fines, and also guidelines for overseas listing, that serves as an example of the interesting power play between market and political power. And yet the party control is evident, as many sectors fell in line with these policy pronunciations, also understood as CCP's economic brand steerage or public opinion guidance. Also, structural changes in the CSC included sectoral strategy of enlivening, leading to miracle growth in the decades of 2000s. And this was achieved through creating institutions, market building, liberalization of foreign trade access, the relaxation of rules and on labor movement and migration. And at the end of this miracle growth, the CSC underwent another shift to bring the new growth drivers. And this journey from 78 to 2000s was also fraught with planning failures, policy missteps, like lean against market forces, industrial policy short of budget, and fiscal crisis. At the same time, a critical policy shift was achieved through the resurgence of budgetary revenues. An example of that is that from 2005, where the budgetary revenue was only 16.9, it had risen from 10.2% in 1995 to 16.9 in 2005. Which led to a greater attention to sectors like human capital, social equity, environmental impact, etc., under the rubrics of scientific development in 11th Five-Year Plan of China. also laid out the foundation for mega and long-term plans, MLPs, through indigenous innovation. So in this entire phase, the way state-owned enterprises and were changed or transformed came out very critically and clearly during the 2006 State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission of the State Council announcement that SOEs were needed to maintain absolute control over at least the 7 key areas, that is military, electricity, oil, telecommunication, coal, civil aviation, shipping sectors. And this also, in a sense, reaffirmed the centrality of SOEs, at least at that point in time. And many analysts have pointed out to the fact that since then, the SOEs have had a very surprisingly consistent role through Hu Jintao's term and to Xi's tenure. And if we are able to compare them, the SOEs have remained at the core of the market economy, even though it is state-led, even during the restructuring drive of late 90s. And if we look at the motto that the Chinese state gave at that point in time, grasp the large and let the small go, we saw that large SOEs got the first-hand access to equity financing for the first time in that sense. And by the end of 2007, central SOEs had agreed to turn over 10% of their profits to Ministry of Finance, thereby retaining a great say in the disposition of money. Next slide, please. The global financial crisis in 2008-2010 drew greater governmental intervention, and the Chinese industrial policy that emerged from innovation-driven development strategy of 2016 relied heavily on technological revolution. This revolution was, of course, founded on the triangle of communication, data, and artificial intelligence, which was jointly conceived of as a single general-purpose technology. And this general purpose technology, of course, this kind of innovation is considered to be once in a century innovation and has kind of started getting implemented in China across industries, agriculture, and services, thereby providing yet another impetus of the transformation of state-led capitalism. If we look at the data from 2020 of the World Bank, China's economy is now split roughly 60 to 40% between private and public sectors. And there are estimates that show that SOEs in the non-financial and financial sectors together generate value added amounting to 25 to 30% of China's GDP. And these numbers are consistent with the occasional statements from Chinese officials that the private sector accounts for about 60% of the GDP. So it is not always straightforward or even appropriate to draw a sharp line between the public and private sector in China, yet the fact that China's formal public sector is quite large helps us understand the way in which it operates within now mainly a private sector economy. So today there are 3 primary actors in Chinese state capitalism: state-owned enterprises, privately owned national champions, and sovereign wealth funds. And if we were to look at just one example from my paper, the Ministry of Commerce, the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administrative Commission of the State Council, provincial governments, private enterprises, and chambers of commerce, all of these entities frame China's state business relations. And MOFCOM has the main responsibility, of course, for policy coordination and implementation in respect of all foreign aid and trade-related issues. However, beyond the central state, a key feature that has been growing in terms of its significance are the provinces. And according to one recent assessment, there are approximately 1 million subnational SOEs, and these operate in a highly diversified architecture of provincial government regulation, of which interprovincial barriers to mergers and acquisitions are an example. Now, if we look at CSE's interlinkages with the global capital, China's economic rise has reshaped the structure of world economy. And the external role that CSE has been playing, it has been controversial, as there is a debate between those who see China's role as aggressive, competitive, and even hegemonic, and those who see the relationship as that of one which brings mutual benefit to both China and global capital. China's large state sector has changed the global balance between the public and private sector. And there is one example that the value added produced by Chinese SOEs accounted for about about 1% of total GDP, global GDP at market exchange rates in 2000, the year 2000, when China was producing about 3.5% of global GDP. And since then, if we look at the growth, Chinese SOEs have grown roughly as fast as Chinese private companies, maintaining their share of GDP. So they are much larger entities today. And by 2018 accounts, China accounted for about 17% of global GDP, which means its SOEs were producing around 4.5% of global GDP. So the Chinese SOEs share of the assets of the largest firms rose from 1.5% in 2000 to 13.3% in 2018, according to IMF data of 2019. Now, much of the economic activity of Chinese SOEs does stay within national borders, yet they have accounted for much of the increase in cross-border flows of investments, lending, and business contracts since 2010. And if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, that serves as one of the examples of SOE's management of majority of overseas projects, and how the CSC has been intervening in that sense. Another sector to look at is the financial sector, which also mediates much of China's expanding industrial policy support to preferred sectors. For instance, if you look at semiconductor firms in many countries, they enjoy sizable tax breaks and investment incentives. The benefits that Chinese companies have received in the form of debt and equity finance are much larger. The state's control of financial system is thus a very crucial tool for realizing its various ambitions. And it is telling that finance today remains one of the most purely state-dominated sectors. 85 to 90% of financial assets are controlled by state-owned institutions. And China has seen an expanding network of politically connected investors in private firms, which often have connection with global capital. These owners, whether state-owned enterprises themselves or owned by them in turn, have helped smaller companies overcome obstacles to their growth and significantly increase the output of private sector. China's growth is based on economic interest of private entrepreneurs and politically connected agents. And private entrepreneurs often have joint ventures with multiple SOEs, which grow substantially after they take on investments from state owners. So this is the connection that basically the private entities have with the SOEs, and how this kind of an outreach and interconnection with global capital has emerged. If we look at the 2008 global financial crisis and the outbreak of COVID-19 in 2020, China's economic recovery has arguably been touted as swifter. Now, according to the by Scott Kennedy and Jude Blanchett in 2021, which was the result of a roundtable, they attributed this faster recovery on the following features of readjustment. One, that there has been a fairly unfettered market for most goods and services, but a restricted market for corporate control. And two, there is unusually large but fragmented state role, both in direct ownership of assets and resource allocation. And three, there is an unusually large role for foreign invested in enterprises. So in terms of foreign invested enterprises, if we were to focus on that point, the CSE is readjusting and transforming at the level of rationale and policy. And one of the examples, if I were to take, in 2009, Premier Wen Jiabao stated that we should hasten the implementation of our going out strategy and combine the utilization of foreign exchange reserve with the going out of our enterprises. Now, going out as a Chinese industrial policy strategy is a part of China's proactive diplomacy. It was envisioned to encourage and support firms with comparative advantage to invest overseas. Many overseas Chinese firms do not exhibit any concrete understanding of the state's policy related to going global and investing in world markets. And I'm quoting from one of the studies which emerged in 2021 by Ku et al. In this study, which took the example of interviews conducted in 2016, firm representatives identified the going out or going global strategy, industrial structural adjustment and transfer of production over capacity policy in the trade zones as initiatives contributing to their own growth and development of their own business firms, and interpreted it at the level of vision and not as a set of very rigid policies or strategies to be followed in verbatim terms. So that's an example of how at the level of policy or agenda setting or providing a vision, there has been a kind of CSE role, but it has readjusted so far as giving a kind of very loose blueprint is concerned, and not really intervening too much at the level of how these firms behaved once they reached the overseas markets. Finally, if we look at clashes between CSC and US capitalism, there are certain discontents which emerge from the reading of most of the analysis that is built around this kind of narrative, that China is huge and increasingly successful in sectors that have traditionally been US strength, that China's state capitalism distorts global markets in ways that harm US companies and industries, and finally that US does not like the nature of Chinese state, given so many political factors therein, and views China's increased strength as a national security risk. And the latest in this that I have quoted is Barry Norton. So threat of an increasingly Chinese venture capitalist state for the purpose of our discussion is quite important, because this venture capitalist state organizes a portfolio of investment in a range of technology industries, financed both by the general partner, which is the state, and the limited partner, which is basically private sector and foreign capital. And once financed, these companies operate in largely competitive market. So the idea of venture capitalist state, as has been appropriated by Chinese state capitalism, is quite interesting. And it is often taken as one of the valid economic threats when it comes to clashes between US capitalism and Chinese state capitalism. One of the responses, which is a possible, most probable scenario in this case, is that past Chinese industrial policies efforts have delivered very mixed results, and in this venture capitalist state overture. And the fact that more money is attached to present effort does not mean that the success rate will be higher. And even if this idea of venture capitalist state succeeds in upgrading China's technological capacities, it is still not very clear, and perhaps to say that it will create any kind of Chinese controlled companies that may seriously threaten the position of US technology industries. And the second threat, which is very often counted as the current threat scenario related to Chinese state capitalism in terms of its economic clashes with the US, is that much of China's technology drive is essentially defensive. Its investment in semiconductors, for instance, reflects the reality that China's technology industry remains heavily dependent on imported chip, and that its domestic chip production depends on equipments that is virtually, that is basically a monopoly of the US and its allies. Now, the efforts of CSE appear to be aimed at this kind of achieving a kind of technology self-sufficiency, and therefore, if its efforts succeed, there may be a threat to the monopoly that US and its allies enjoy. Even if China succeeds in becoming more technologically self-sufficient by creating domestic alternatives with limited global connections or limited global competitiveness, this does not necessarily mean that US technology industries are right now in peril. In fact, excessive efforts by the US to decouple the US and Chinese economies could be considered more costly, as has been the result of many scholarly analysis in this regard. And finally, looking at CSE and the sub-regional expansion, where BRI and foreign policy readjustments are concerned, CSE has been confronted with US capitalism and a constant demand for newer markets expanding in the Asian region in a big way. Since 2000 has been the foreign policy overture of Chinese state capitalism. And China's Belt and Road Initiative contributed to this expansion in a big way. The BRI initiative was conceived to improve and strengthen the activities of the Chinese SOEs at the global level. It was proposed by the Chinese state that BRI will be able to reinforce the economy of small and developing countries in nearby regions, as also provide the economic growth and incentive to Chinese enterprises with more opportunities outside China, that is in the sub-regions of Asia and Eurasia. If we look at the level of regional order, how it impacts the regional order, BRI contests several elements of current regional order in Asia. BRI reflects a readjustment of Chinese foreign policy from East Asian region to Eurasian continent. And in this sense, through BRI, China is returning to its legitimate position. Many scholars from China have said that it's returning to its legitimate position at the center of the region. And it was also stated by Major General Xiaoliang that BRI has a Tianxia feeling to it. BRI helps CSC construct a regional order closer to Chinese preference, therefore. And it also creates the premise for a Chinese foreign policy in contradiction with the practice of non-interference and respect of sovereignty, as has been pointed out in certain cases. One of the examples would be debt trap scenarios created in BRI partner countries. BRI also therefore represents a fundamental step in the process of contestation of market as regional primary institutions through the advancement of state capitalist practices. Finally, in conclusion, I would like to propose that the emergent interlinkages of CSC-GC interactions are based on, one, the transformation of SOEs and emergence of multiple economic players, and the state-business relations have acquired a non-homogeneous, fragmented, and multi-level dimension. Two, the phase of Sino-American animosity as a result of clash between CSC and US capitalism was counterbalanced by CSC with its expansion and growth at sub-regional and regional level of capital networks. I'll rest here. I'll rest my argument here, and thank you so much. I'm looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rityusha, for that wonderful exposition, elaborating. Rather giving a bird's view, kaleidoscopic view of China's state capitalism and its global capital, and then relating it to the market and political power inside China. And what of data you have given from the World Bank, 2020. So. Where, of course, I think this is inherent with the structure of the capital within the SOEs and other variety of you can say this economic entities inside China. The first speaker, so she didn't say it clearly, authoritarian digitization, but I think this is one of the coming sector. Perhaps you must have looked into it, but given the constraints of time, perhaps you didn't get to elaborate it. For example, universalization of digital economy in China now, it is one of the one of the biggest pillars. 9.7% growth of the domestic it has registered 9.7% of the growth. And it accounts for over 38% of China's GDP, and the total value it has generated is 39.2 trillion yuan. So it is massive, and that is perhaps one of the areas which has given China hope for this internal circulation, or rather a consumption-driven economy, rather than export-driven economy, which is now dwindled to around 16%. And you also nicely linked, how Chinese companies have been supported by state. One of the examples nowadays, especially in the EV sector, is BYD, which has also made considerable investments in India. So it has registered. Perhaps except Tesla in China, over $400 million of revenues, whereas its assistance from the state is $700 million US. So if discounted, then it is also running into loss. Another thing, perhaps is slightly I would disagree. That is China's technology drive is rather defensive. I mean, it must be highly dependent on the US and West, but the way it has invested and the kind of companies we have seen registered in semiconductor industry, they are massive, 142,000 plus companies. So they are vigorously, developing their semiconductor industry. And 38,000, so they were registered just in this year, and then they have made certain progress, but of course it still has to a long way to go. But well, I think there are already questions trailing for you in the chat box, so be ready for a lot of questions. So next speaker is Dr. Carleton from ORF, Carleton, over to you. You have 20 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll start with sharing my presentation. So firstly, I'd like to thank Professor Rityusha Tiwary and the organizers for having invited me here. And the topic for my presentation is China's new nationalism. What are the trends? What are the kind of trends that are happening in Chinese society? What are the kind of the debates that are emerging out of Beijing? What are the debates that are emerging in the language media of China? So I'd like to start first with a small what is the economic situation in China? I mean, if you look at the if you rank GDPs, of cities, I mean, if you rank Chinese cities according to their GDPs, what you will realize is that since this year, about 70 cities in fact, more than 70 cities have seen a severe to very, very severe lockdown. Now, the Chinese economy is growing at the slowest pace since since the onset of the pandemic. Wenjing spoke about the migration, but that is also migration out of China. But I think one place where this zero COVID policy has hit China, has hit the economy, is especially to do with the employment scenario. This year, again, a record 10 million people are about to enter the job market. And there are certain data points that I would like to share. The unemployment scenario is extremely worrisome for the Chinese regime. And if you see the 16 to 24 age group, you'll realize that in January, March, there was about 16% unemployment. There is a study by Beijing University that says that in mid 2020, when the pandemic was at its height, China saw about 92 million people who were unemployed, and this made up about 12% of the working age adults in China. Now, the Beijing University's survey also says that there is a possibility that this year that threshold might be breached. Again, we've seen protests on Chinese campuses. Also, a lot of Chinese campuses, a lot of Chinese students are trying to delay their entry into the job market. Now, if you compare the figures of 2021, about 4% of the students opted for doctoral and postdoctoral education. Now, look at 2020, it's about 11%. So there is this whole tendency to delay their entry into the job market. Again, over a period of time, if you see the trajectory of the Chinese economy, there has been an issue with double-digit growth. Now, double-digit growth has really come to an end. The miracle growth that has come to an end, and what has happened is in a regime where the government legitimacy depends on its ability to deliver goodies to its people, and in lieu of the people renouncing its rights, I think this is a serious challenge for the Communist Party. And this is also because of its history. If you see at the height of the Tiananmen incident, you've had unemployment. There was a high amount of unemployment. So these are really questions for this is a big question mark on the Communist Party. Now, again, what is China doing to counter this this perception, or what is China doing to counter this kind of slide, if you may call it? Now, one thing is that there's a tendency to infuse military values of patriotism, unity, discipline into civil society. Now, I'll give you 2-3 instances of this. First is there is a greater connect to the youth, to the youngsters of China. This year, the Communist Youth League, it completed its 100 years, and if you see Xi Jinping's speech to the Communist Youth League, to its own cadres, and to the broader youngsters in China, it was about how they needed to overcome difficulties. It was about how his generation faced a lot of difficulties. It was, and that they needed to, the times will be tough, and that you need to kind of, overcome these hardships. May 4th is celebrated as Youth Day in China, and Xi Jinping takes up this occasion to visit Renmin University, where he tries to, he makes a pitch for expanding the ideological and political education programs that the party has undertaken. Again, another component of this is this constant, almost a Confucian essaying of positive role models. So a lot of, the Chinese regulator, the media regulator, has decreed that a lot of role models have to be, who do not conform to the parties, to the Communist Party's standards of masculinity, have been erased out of mass media. There are also other issues like, you need to be a good citizen and you need to pay your taxes. So that is one of the things. Also, there is a very, very conscious effort to revive war memories of war, memories of conflict, and memories of, soldiers, Chinese soldiers. So there is one instance where, again, at the same ceremony of the Communist Youth League, Xi Jinping quotes a poem by a soldier who died in the clashes in Ladakh. Also, this year, at a soldier was chosen as a torchbearer, a soldier who served in Ladakh and was leading was leading the PLA there, was chosen as a person who was a torchbearer for the Olympics. Now, there is also last year, 2019, was a red letter day for the Communist Party because it completed 100 years. Now, what you very consciously realize is that there was a high-profile commemoration of the Korean War. The Korean War anniversary, again, I'll come back to that later. There was in the 1970s, there was a movie that was produced in China. It was called as the Battle of the Shangangling Mountain. This was one of the first movies that China produced on the exploits of the volunteer army that went to Korea. Now, this movie was re-released this year, and it has become quite popular in China. Then there have been diktats to cinema houses that they need to allocate a number of screenings to screen war movies. So there is a certified list of war movies that is there. And secondly, there is this whole legend of Commander Wang Wei. Now, Wang Wei was one of the commanders who, I think Professor Mattingly made a reference to this, that he was one of there was a US spy plane incident where a Chinese plane crashed into a US spy plane, and Wang Wei was in the Chinese plane, and he perished. And over a period of time, Wang Wei's legend has grown. So what he was considered as a decorated war hero, and simultaneously over a period of time, there is a conscious move to kind of appropriate him. So very recently, a letter surfaced of his where he professes a lot of love for the nation, a lot of love for, and he professes his wish to join the Communist Party. So this is, I think, the sole the sole aim of this is to kind of to make a huge outreach to the youth community in China. Now, how does this really fit into the CCP's goals? Now, again, back to the Korean War anniversary, Xi Jinping's speech really talks about how the volunteer army, the People's Volunteer Army, managed to defeat a better placed rival. So obviously, it is referring to America. But despite this, really, the PLA has not really been tested in battle. I mean, the last war it fought was in Vietnam, and the PLA suffered severe reverses during that confrontation. Again, the People's Daily has spoken about how economic prosperity is typically hollowing out the Chinese. So this is, and again, if you see the Vietnam War, it is at around this time that Xi Jinping starts his career, and he starts his career in the Central Military Commission. So this is something where this is something which has struck a chord with him, perhaps. So the whole idea of injecting militarism is that China needs better foot soldiers for its army. Now, again, back to the discussion about why does China need better soldiers, better foot soldiers? I think the plenum of 2020, when the Chinese Communist Party elite met, really saw a reevaluation of the PLA's role. I mean, there seems to be a feeling that it is not just being it is not just as a reinforcer of the Communist Party's regime security, but I think it has to have a greater role. Now, one of the development goals that was cited by in the plenum communique speaks about the PLA's modernization and how this modernization will really realize the potential of a rich nation and a strong army. Now, there's also a reference to how there is chaos in the West, and that China can use this as a stepping stone to becoming a superpower. But at the same time, there is a caveat that there is a fear that the West will definitely stymie its rise. So this is the background. This is really the background to what is happening, what the Communist Party is thinking about. Now, again, back to see, BRI has. I mean, BRI is of course Xi Jinping's pet theme, and it has been his pet project. And there has been a post BRI. You've seen Chinese companies and Chinese people go abroad, especially. But this kind of a going abroad cannot really. It also is incumbent on them getting enmeshed in the local politics of these nations. Now, you've had the instance where in Pakistan, 3 Chinese educators who were at the Confucian Center at Karachi University, they were killed in a suicide bombing. So there are these issues. Again, the issue of Solomon Islands, where Chinese businesses and Chinese people were specifically targeted. So now let us look at the instance of Cambodia. Now, about 75% of Cambodia's electricity plants are either built or operated by the PRC. Now, is that the reason why? Is that the sole reason why the PRC seeks to, get a strategic hold in the Riam naval base, the renovation? Again, back to the Solomon Islands. Now, again, the Solomon Islands has been a focus of the Communist Party. In fact, there was a press conference, and the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry specifically talks about Solomon Islands being the site of some new BRI projects and a special economic zone. Now, the whole idea of an investment is that it guarantees you returns. Now, that guaranteeing you returns is also incumbent on political stability. So now again, there has been a much touted agreement between China and Solomon Islands. Now again, is is this agreement a security agreement where China talks about upgrading its internal about the Solomon Islands internal security capabilities? Now, is this is this a ploy to kind of boost its security presence on the island? Because we've had, India specifically has had this instance where every rising power seeks to kind of get a foothold in a certain region. And like, for example, the East India Company started, it was like the flag following the trade. So there were a couple of outposts initially in India, and then they grew, and of course, the rest is history. Lastly, every political history of the world, political history of powers is really a linear history of regimes, of empires, the rise and fall of empires. So, like in 1869, the restoration, Meiji Restoration, Japan went in to consolidate its hold, and it developed, it gave the war cry of rich nation, strong army. Again, that is referenced by the plenum of 2020. Japan industrialized its, indigenized its industrial base, and you have China, which similarly is talking about self-reliance in today's context. Again, there are several templates from Germany. So if you look at how, the current CCP almost sees itself as, all encompassing all under the heaven. It sees itself as the new communist dynasty. Just like Germany, there is a narrative about the Chinese race being superior. There is also the whole narrative of weaponizing its history, weaponizing its past history, and concomitantly, there is a rise in its territorial claims. So the third prong of this has been, again, like Germany, there has been a political mobilization of youth and a cult of personality, which is personified in the Xi Jinping thought. So I leave it at that, and this is again things for us to ponder over. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalpit, for elaborating various facets of China's nationalism under Xi Jinping, starting from economic situation, and right up to how the party and the leadership, so they are injecting this populist nationalism as such, and how it is aiding CCP's political goals. So now I think we'll move to our discussant, Rian Haas. Over to you. You will have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Deepak. And I will offer 3 reflections upon the great presentations that we just heard, and add one other provocation for the discussion that will follow. I need to apologize in advance that I will need to leave in 12 minutes. So I will share my comments as efficiently as I can in order to maximize the time that's available for discussion. One of the themes that really came through in all 3 presentations and served as a common thread was this theme about President Xi's commitment to projecting the superiority of the Chinese system, of infusing nationalism, and when facts don't support the assertion that the Chinese system is superior, nationalism often seems to be serving as a substitute. When there is decelerating economic growth rates, it's blamed upon a hostile West and its partners that are seeking to suppress China's rise. When COVID waves spread across the country, there are increased uses by wolf warrior diplomats about US lab leaks as the source of the original virus, about bioweapons labs in Ukraine, et cetera. When there's domestic criticism of the zero COVID policy and its draconian effects upon lockdowns of major cities, people who raise these concerns are accused of colluding with foreign forces to disrupt the harmony and unity of the Chinese people. And underneath all this, there's, as the speakers discussed, this real invocation of the need for a fighting spirit. That China faces external hostility and needs to come together to overcome the hostility that is confronting the country at this time. So I think that theme and message really came through in all of the presentations. I thought that Rityusha's presentation really did a good job of talking about the shifts that are taking place with China's state-led capitals or state-led economic model. And we see that in the trade flows. If you look at where China's trade, import and export flows are turning to, they're turning to their periphery, to RCEP countries primarily. China trades more now with RCEP countries than it does with the United States and Europe combined, for example. That's a new development, and I think it also speaks to China's desire to try to insulate itself from exposure to pressure from the West. I would say, since I'm speaking from Washington and feel like a lucky beneficiary of being able to listen to this conversation, that from an American perspective, I think that there's growing skepticism that China will succeed in its quest for technological self-sufficiency. I think there also is growing skepticism about the value and output of China's industrial policies. Rityusha's presentation touched upon some of this, but that's a theme that I hear often in conversations I'm a part of in the United States. One of the questions that I had listening to the presentations was, all the presentations in their own way seem to really shine a spotlight upon the fact that China is a bit off course right now, that the actions that are being taken are leading to the opposite of the intended effects. And I think that Wenjing really set this up well in her opening presentation. In the past, when that has been the case, there has been self-correction on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. They've been capable of pragmatism and adaptability, responding to inputs and adjusting course. Is that still possible? Is China capable of self-correction in this current moment? Or are they just going to have to continue plowing down the path that they presently are on? So that's a question that I would just sort of tee up for the discussion. One other observation that I would offer is just a minor provocation, is looking at the year ahead, because all three of the presentations really sort of painted a rather dark picture, if you think about it, of where China's pointed. Typically, the first year of new administrations are the year when the big actions, the big efforts, the big muscle movements take place. This is when the big ambitions are expressed and pursued. 2023 is going to be a year where President Xi is going to want to demonstrate momentum coming out of the Party Congress, while the United States is going to be turning inward as it focuses on its 2024 presidential election. India is going to begin focusing on its own upcoming elections. And in the case of Taiwan, they also will be focusing on their own election. And so what impact or effect will this sort of divergent focuses have on the conduct of relations between China and these other important actors? But Professor Deepak, I just want to thank you and also the presenters for such rich insights. It's really been a privilege for me to be a part of it. And I hope that I've provided a bit of grist to help stimulate the discussion.
Thank you, Rian. Yes, you have. I think we still have 20 minutes for Q&A. So thank you very much. And I can see there are a lot of questions addressed to Rityusha, I think 3 of them, and 1 or 2 to Kalpit. So maybe we'll start with Rityusha. The first question to you is from Ambassador Kishan Rana. So he asks, what is China's tax to GDP rate? My impression is that it is around 24% or so. India is barely at 17%. Most European countries are around 30%. Rityusha, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ryan, for those comments. Addressing Ambassador Rana's question first, the tax to GDP ratio in case of China in 2020 was around 20% according to OECD data. Which was, the average of Asia Pacific is largely 19% during that time. So it was above that average, but it was below the OECD average of 33.5%, as has been pointed out by Ambassador Rana himself. Now, we also know that China's tax GDP ratio decreased by 2% from 2019 to 2020. And though it had been successfully increasing between 2007 to 2020 in general. So and the primary factors related in this are actually excluding the revenues from social security contributors. So that's also one caveat one might want to look up to when looking at the tax GDP ratio. Moving on to Professor Ritu Agarwal's question. Chair, may I just move on?
Yeah, sure, please. Yeah, continue. Yeah, just save time.
How far do you think Chiang Zemin's leadership played proactive role in terms of integrating Chinese SOEs with global capitalism? Now, the ownership restructuring of SOEs actually happened in a major way during or under Chiang Zemin's time, specifically in 1997, when he opened the 15th Communist Party Congress by embracing a program of bold economic reforms with respect to SOEs. The party ideology that was regarding the reform and opening up was followed up in a big way during that time. And the slogans, the directives of Deng Xiaoping in that regard were adopted by Chiang Zemin and were operationalized by major groups and supporters who the pro-reformers in that sense. And there was a highly contentious debate regarding the nature of reform that Chiang Zemin and his allies were promoting. But still, I think the ideological line that was given by Deng was very skillfully employed and operationalized by Chiang Zemin and the rest of the reformist group. Majority of China's 13,000 large and medium-sized SOEs at that point in time were privatized or sold off, as it were. And many of the smaller companies were also sold off in the sense that there was a shareholding system that was created, which kind of greatly increased the number of enterprises which had offering for private selling stock. I mean, it was open for public. So I hope that answers in some way the question. Moving on to Ravi Bhutalingam sir's question, whether US capital is caught in a kind of bind and how much of a decoupling is possible. Is it only relegated to the rhetoric? Now, the policy responses within the US have typically been, mostly of 4 kinds so far as US response to this decoupling is concerned. One of the possibilities is where it is proposed that US employs an offensive tactic to strengthen the US economy vis-a-vis the Chinese economy. The other proposal is basically to implement defensive measures to reduce and mitigate these downsides of China's system. Yet another proposal has been to set up and enforce international rule to align with US interest and norms. So therefore set up multilateral organizations, strengthen the rule of law in the region and counter China in that sense. And finally, many of the responses have also suggested that the continued connectivity between US and China has to be there has to be a continued connectivity between US and China, and there has to be a able management of disagreement between the two. So looking at these 4 plausible, distinctive set of proposals which emanate from policymakers and scholars who opine about what could be the possible ideas regarding decoupling, where do we exactly locate the feasibility of decoupling. I feel that the 2 intensive years of trade wars, it really appeared that there was a kind of impasse that both the sides faced, and looking at the way the respective economies continued their connectivities, and the attraction of Chinese financial sector for foreign firms is very substantial, and it has just grown larger. The China's financial service market is around $47 trillion, and the previous restrictions that were there on foreign firms meant that the access to this financial market was very limited. But then with the help of the recent liberalization in the financial sector in China, I think the interest of US financial institutions has just grown from strength to strength. And I think I'll just quote one example and kind of move on. PayPal in 2019 acquired a 70% stake in Chinese firm GoPay, making the PayPal the first foreign company to provide online payment services in China. So this kind of an interest, this kind of a interest of US financial institutions in the financial market of China is just gonna go on increasing. So any decoupling for that matter is very it would need I think a steady rethinking so far as the interest of US financial institutions is concerned. I would say that that's where I would kind of like to rest my argument. In terms of, or are there any questions specifically now addressed to me?
Yeah, I think there is one more by Ravi. Is state capitalism more appropriate?
I was answering Ravi Bhutilingam sir's question only regarding.
Okay. In fact, he posed two questions.
Yeah.
Okay, then we move to Kalpit. Kalpit, you want me to read your question, or you can go through it yourself?
Yes, I think one of the questions by Rajesh Raina is. See, almost all countries are passing through the economic downturn in terms of all vital aspects of the economy, including high unemployment rate. What is singularly so different about the Chinese economy at this stage, which is the main cause of worry for everyone? So I think I get your point. I mean, people are, all countries are going through this, but I think, see, in the past, if you compare, if you compare China's response in the past is, like, let us see what happened during Great Leap Forward. So any reverses on the economy, there was this whole pressure on Mao. He was relegated to the second line of leadership. Now, the response to that was, there was renewed aggression on our borders. So I think this is the larger point that I'm trying to make, that the internal and external dynamics of China can never really be separated, and we are at the brunt of this kind of pressure. So that's the larger point I was trying to make.
Kalpit, there is another question from Bhagat Rama. At a time when the whole world was witnessing negative growth, China was amongst the few countries which witnessed positive growth. Would it be appropriate to say that the Chinese miracle growth rate has dropped, or as the party may like to justify, the Chinese model is amongst the few success stories as compared to the West?
I think I'm not getting into the statistics of it, but very recently there was a leaked memo by Ran Zhangfei. Now, Ran Zhangfei is an insider. He is a true insider of both the Communist Party's economic muscle, if you were to call it that. And I think somewhere there is when an insider starts kind of sounding alarm, look at the responses of Li Keqiang. Li Keqiang is constantly talking about unemployment. There is this whole effort to be seen as doing something. So I think this is something we cannot ignore.
Okay, I think then we don't have any more question here. Any more question from the audience? I see there are still 47 people listening. We still have some more time because I think a session is supposed to conclude at 8:15, right, Anuksha?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, then maybe I can have 4 or 5 minutes for myself. Is there any question?
Sir, apologies to interrupt. We have 3 questions, one on the chat box, and we have 2 hands raised, Mr. Ravi Bhootlingam and Ambassador Kishan Rana.
Okay, okay. So please, maybe Ambassador Rana, you first. You have to unmute yourself. Ambassador Rana, are you listening? I think we are not. So maybe
I'm not being unmuted. Please unmute me.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. For some strange reason, my video has decided not to work today. Now, I have a question that I want to put to everyone, which is anyone who wishes to respond. My question is that nobody has talked about the controls that China has placed on the private enterprises, the squeeze that's been put on them, even to the point where foreign companies, joint ventures, branches of foreign countries are now required to have a party committee. And I asked this question of a Chinese professor at one of our Wednesday seminars at the Institute of Chinese Studies. And he said, well, that's normal. That happens in every country. Now, does anyone want to talk about how China is now bulldozing private enterprises into conformity? Thank you.
Okay, Rityusha, would you like to answer to that?
I'm sorry, I just got the last part of Ambassador Rana's thing that China is bulldozing.
Putting control, on enterprises, especially private enterprises, and establishing these party branches across all of them.
Yeah, and I think that kind of partly answers Ravi Bhootlingham's second question, whether state capitalism can still be used as a category and whether we should use the term state enterprises. I think this is a very stark example of state capitalism, because unless you have that kind of control over private entities and the control of state power over these private enterprises, it wouldn't really be state capitalism. And that seems to be the trend now. State supervision and regulation of capitalist, economic investment, that's a very important aspect of state capitalism. So I feel that there is this trend of not letting go of, the control that state enjoys over private entities.
Yeah, Ravi, perhaps you have to wait for a minute. Before that, we'll turn to Wenjing. So there's a question to her from Ambassador Nambiar. Wenjing, how much of the ontological insecurity that you have suggested actually informs the deliberations and consultation in the party as they prepare for the 20th Congress? Over to you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Okay. How much? I think that's have to relate to what Mr. Xi thinks, which I really cannot project how much that he's concerned. But as far as I concerned, all the with the China water is concerned, is, I mean, the level is very high. That I can only answer for that. I'm sorry. Because I think this extreme, lockdown has already, intensified, especially even nowadays in Xinjiang and in Chongqing, as just before the professor mentioned at the very beginning. So I think that some of the local party cadres also very concerned about this, and the people are basically go route because they lost their job, they don't have food. It's completely disaster, and it's just back to that reminds the Mao time in the Great Leap Forward, 大跃进. So this is man-created disaster, which the bottom is actually really suffering mentally and as well as economically. But for him, I do understand. I'm not trying to defend him, but I do understand as a leader, he wants to accomplish his goal, but he may a lot of detached from the bottom, and he has stayed in his intention, but good intention sometimes cannot transfer to the good consequences. Yeah, that's it.
There is another question for you from Partha Mukhopadhyay. Will the election of Xi Jinping lead to the end of the zero COVID policy, or will it continue? Briefly, before I go to Ravi.
Oh, I hope so. I do hope so. That's it.
Okay. Ravi, over to you. I'm sorry, you got to wait for some time.
Professor, apologies to interrupt, but can we take Ravi sir's question as the last one?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
You have to unmute, Ravi.
Just a moment. I'll request.
There's a question by Ambassador Nambiar in the chat box for Wenjing.
I think she addressed one, didn't she?
I think, Rityusha, you had partly answered my question, but about state capitalism, state enterprise. My thought was that capitalism is not the right word. Maybe there is some other word. It is a very peculiar hybrid, the Chinese version, because some of the aspects of capitalism, like stockholder democracy, are simply not there. But some of the other aspects, like monopoly control of the tech monopolies, are being handled better than the US is doing with its technological giants. So it's a strange animal for which I'm suggesting a new term may have to be invented. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. I think we still have just 3 minutes, so perhaps I will use this to conclude the session. I think, one thing is for sure, which perhaps addresses the questions raised by some of the participants, that the age of laissez-faire in China, it is over. I think that is very, very clear. The way Xi Jinping is, taking absolute control of the party, of the military, and perhaps in the coming days, the enterprises, and the way the enterprises are suffering in China, especially the small and medium. The data for this year, it is self-explanatory. This year alone, 460,000 small and small and medium enterprises, they have shut down. It shows where China is heading for. And second point, perhaps I would like to make, which is also related to to China's like domestic governance, how it reflects on China's foreign policy. So that is, of course, the American viewpoint, or the viewpoint of the West, that China, as a coercive and revisionist power, is seeking to establish the China-centric world order, which is antithetical to the liberal values of the West. But surprisingly, I don't know how many of you have noticed that. So this has been acknowledged by the Chinese scholarship, but of course, qualitatively differently in domestic discourse, mostly in Chinese writing, perhaps for domestic consumption also. For example, Renmin University professor Di Dongshang, he has categorically said that China wishes to decouple from the American bubble. But in the general discourse, which we get to see in the English writings and also the mainstream Chinese writing, it is the other way around. It is the West which is wanting to decouple from China. And Di Dongshang, he says that China wanted to create a bubble of its own, away from the American bubble, and where the people will follow Chinese model of governance and values. And this has been also accepted by, some of the, I would say, Raja Gurus of China, say professor from Fudan University, Zhang Weiwei, and Renmin University professor Qin Sanrong. So these people, so they believe that the U.S., it was also put forth by some of the panelists. The notion is the U.S. has been on the decline and China is on the rise. So much so that it has run out with the ideas. That's the assertion of the Chinese scholars, that they are copying the Chinese connectivity initiatives and launching their own, such as Build Back Better Wall, and a recent announcement, so that the US will be spending over $600 billion over 5 years period in the Indo-Pacific. So Zhang Weiwei, in fact, he argues that these concepts, will be limited to the freedom of expression in courts and would be forgotten. So conversely, the BRI is unmatchable according to the Chinese scholarship, which I think it is. The way the Chinese has spent money in it, extended the reach of it, across Eurasia and also Africa and Latin America. The promised investment, the benefit it has brought to the developing countries in Asia and Africa. So there is perhaps a liking for the Chinese development model in these countries. But of course, in the long run, it has to be tested because as of now, especially in the developing world, people will look towards China for the investment and perhaps securing their interest through these. But of course, Chinese, they don't talk about, they're silent about the debt trap and other neo-colonialist tendencies which have been debated. And these are also, perhaps forming the pillars of the China's foreign policies. So which of course is an extension to what China does domestically. I think we have had a brilliant session and all the speakers, so they were brilliant. I thank them all. So please join me in thanking Rityusha, thanking Wenjing, and thanking Carleton for their wonderful presentations, and also ICS and the China Policy Group for holding such a wonderful conference. From my side, that's it. Over to the host.
Thank you so much, sir. With this, we come to the end of session 6, the final session of our first conference on domestic governance. I express my sincere gratitude to the chair, the discussant, and the speakers for their remarks and for patiently addressing the questions and comments posed by the audience. I also express my sincere gratitude to the audience for interacting with the speakers and for tuning into our 6th session and for staying with us this far in the 2-day conference. We'll right away move into our concluding session, which was set to begin at 8:15 p.m. IST. So I warmly welcome you back to the concluding session of the first iteration of our flagship conference on domestic governance in China. So we organized a 2-day conference at ICS in partnership with the Center for Policy Research, and the conference featured 6 sessions with speakers presenting 18 papers on topics pertaining to subnational governance in China, PLA party-state relations, science, technology and innovation, Chinese domestic economy, and much more. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 2 eminent panelists for the concluding session. Joining us is Dr. Manoranjan Mohanty, who was a professor of political science and director, Developing Countries Research Center at the University of Delhi, where he taught comparative politics, Chinese politics and research methodology. He's also distinguished professor at the Council for Social Development, New Delhi. Also joining us is Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, Honorary Fellow, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. The housekeeping rules for the audience remain the same. All participants are requested to stay muted. Comments can be posted in the chat box. However, there will be no questions and answers. And this session is being recorded and live streamed on the ICS YouTube channel. With this, I request Dr. Mohanty to kindly address the audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anushka. You have guided us these 2 days so efficiently. And thank you, my friend, Ambassador Kishan Rana, and the great team and the partnership with CPR. I know we are all under stress of various kinds, but this conference has gone on so well. I really am very proud of being part of this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Okay. I think this conference had so many things to talk about. The biggest takeaway is, right from session 1 to session 6, is the openness of the discourse, that we have multiple perspectives on contemporary China, and this group of scholars boldly present them, but also allow them to be discussed. And in a way, it was also a cotton razor for our understanding of the forthcoming 20th Party Congress of the CPC. But our kind of understanding and cotton razor puts each one of these questions in historical terms, in long-term perspectives, in interconnections. And, as the last session put it very well, the interlinkages between domestic governance and the global realm, international governance. Well, governance or the international arena. So the big takeaway is this openness, whether it is about economy, about party, about PLA, about innovation, about the questions that we addressed in all the 6 sessions. We were looking at each question in depth, and not only in macro terms, but also in micro terms. And we had so many case studies which illustrated big theoretical questions. So that is the big takeaway, the opening of this discourse on contemporary China. I have I got three major insights from this conference as a whole, and those are with regard to understanding the economic process. But here again, economic process seen both in whether it is about anti-corruption at the grassroots level, whether it is inequalities. Inequalities didn't come up as major papers, but in comments and in discussions. But our understanding of the Chinese economy, it came up again and again. How do we understand this slowdown in relative terms? How do we understand the linkages between the economic performance and the 2035 goal or the 2049 goal, the centenary goal? Strong, modern, prosperous socialist country. Strong, modern, prosperous, underlying prosperous. In other words, a certain growth rate has to be maintained, and for that, whatever is needed has to be done. Therefore, does that show some contradictions? And those contradictions, even if they lead to increasing inequalities, increasing regional disparities, even if they require, using BRI for that same purpose, we saw all that. The linkages between SOE performance, SOE management, and the taking advantage of the international linkages with the global capitalism. So we got a lot of insights on Chinese economy in a very specific kind of way. The second was about innovation and the global dimension. You see, innovation, the science and technology, and innovation discourse was again another excellent session, where two aspects of innovation became very clear. Innovation is a comparative perspective, and you cannot be competing with the best global innovation realm and yet be closing certain arenas in the name of becoming self-reliant or inward-looking. So the contradiction came up very well. And as Ravi put it in his comments, on the one hand, they are increasing their capacity for innovation through investments, through many other things. On the other hand, they're also conscious of some of the structural constraints on innovation. And how they are overcoming that will be something to watch. The third arena on which a lot of insight we got was the security discourse. Here again, we had two sessions which gave us ideas on security, not only in how the PLA was, the National Security Commission paper, how that institution is being used, but also how the whole process of promotion and management of the PLA and parties' control over that is maintaining security for the party. But on all these three aspects, we have some big questions which also came up throughout, and with that I will conclude. And that really takes us to our theoretical framework on governance. My generation used the term state and society, government and politics, political economy, state and political economy. And we understood what is called the domestic sphere of politics, society, economy, security. Now we have a very convenient term called governance, which essentially meant decision-making, its implementation and evaluation of the objectives and change in the decision-making process and that process. But now governance is an all-encompassing concept. And that is why, and we could see that in the entire seminar, state was very much discussed. Political economy perspectives were very much there. Historical processes, ideology were very much there. How the arenas of dissent were coming up, despite the party control, were coming up. Therefore, we have to be very clear about the opportunities that the governance perspective brings to be very specific and very concrete in arenas of policy and implementation. But at the same time, we have to relate it to political economy, state, the nature of the state, the social basis of state. And when Ravi asked Rityusha whether state capitalism is the right term, it really is about these questions, social basis of the state. And I think was it Bansi who brought our attention to class analysis of Chinese society. We didn't do that very much. The perspective has its potentiality and has its limits. It took us to some concrete problems. That is the opportunity. But it also didn't focus on arenas of instability, arenas of serious crisis, and how those crises are being maintained. But it was great to really focus on concrete realms of anti-corruption, of decentralization, of clear-cut policies on specific areas. It was a great conference. Thank you all very much for your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for your kind remarks. They were extremely insightful, and for all the support you've provided to the conference. Without further ado, I now invite Dr. Mukhopadhyay for his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anushka. It's been a privilege for CPR to co-host this conference with the ICS. And I am especially fortunate because I have affiliations to both institutions. And therefore, it makes, I feel a little appropriate to sort of conclude the conference. It's difficult to sort of follow Professor Mohanty in anything relating to China. So what I'll do is quickly sort of list out 6 takeaways from the 6 sessions that we have had. Each of them was rich, and what was especially nice was that there was a lot of discussion during the sessions, not only that of the discussant, but also from the audience. And I'm sure that will lead to very rich papers that will hopefully be then moved to being a volume that would sort of emerge from this conference. So in quickly, I know it's getting late. In the first session of the conference, I think one of the interesting issues that came up on domestic governance was the issue of local autonomy. And there, my own understanding of the process is that the reason China can have a fairly high degree of local autonomy in some aspects is largely because there's also a very high degree of party hierarchy. The reason you can give a lot of autonomy to a local official is because you also, unlike, let us say, independently elected mayor of a city in India, you'd also be able to remove the mayor of Shanghai at a moment's notice and send him off to Xinjiang if the need arose. And it is this
quote-unquote governance structure or environment that in some sense would allows the local autonomy to be a characteristic of the yin and the yang, so to speak, of the broad governance system. That's sort of my takeaway from the first session. I'll discuss the second session last, given my own sort of preference for economics. The third session is was I think the one where I learned the most, and especially I learned the most because it's not often they come to a session in China on the party and primacy, and then essentially enter into what is essentially a discussion on literacy. But it was the essentiality and the importance of that in the context of that topic of the party and primacy that it found the importance of discourse and the importance of how each of these things is structured that I found really enlightening. And important as people who work on China to understand, and therefore hence the importance of language, because to be able to understand the way the party works, it's important to how the role that literature plays in that process. Today, we had the session on technology. And there, I think, as Professor Mohanty has already pointed out, the immense contradiction right now of a relatively rapid growth in technological prowess as far as China is concerned, with the current environment that seems to, in some sense, decouple. And the concern that was expressed by, I think, all panelists, that this particular decoupling is essentially going to lower level equilibrium, not only for China, but also for the rest of the world. Because as Stephanie, I think, put it, it's difficult for the Chinese to grow without the world in terms of technological growth, but also it's difficult for the world to grow without the Chinese scientific contribution. And that therefore points out to an area of sort of crystallizes the interlinkages between these two places, I think was quite important. The other issue which came up was the importance of human resources. And I'll come back to that in my last remarks on the economic section. The security session, I think, was interesting in the sense of pointing out the fact that the Chinese view of security is much more composite than perhaps elsewhere in the world, in the sense that, and especially the remarks on the way the National Security Commission in China works, where both domestic and external security is treated in a composite fashion rather than in two separate boxes, as they are in India or even in the US and so on. And what that, the implication for that in the way the engagement of the party with security forces is put together, therefore, is obviously something that would be of much interest, especially as the leader ages and the personal connections that have kept these kinds of structures in places become weaker. The penultimate session we just concluded, of course, is, was extremely interesting. And I'm not going to sort of repeat this because this is everybody who's been on has already listened to that session, but I'll offer maybe one cheeky remark, is that at the end of it, I almost felt that perhaps the session would have been better titled Foreign Imperatives of Domestic Policy in China, because a lot of domestic policy seemed to be responding to the global environment rather than domestic imperatives. So that's how I sort of looked at that process. Let me now conclude by looking at the issue on economics, which has been touched upon not only in the penultimate session, but also in other sessions. And one of the critical points that was made in the session on economics is the fact that China has more or less gone from relatively zero inequality, or rather zero inequality in two boxes, zero inequality in the rural areas and a different level of zero inequality in the urban areas, two inequality levels that are now rivaling the US in the short span of 40 years. And that obviously would have implications not only for growth, but also for political stability. And that is, I think, one of the contradictions that sort of is facing the Chinese government today. And this inequality growth has happened despite a relatively high level of human resource, relatively speaking, as also was referred to also in the technology session. As a result of which, the thrust towards the move to dual circulation in the domestic economy. Therefore, one of the issues that sort of comes up is whether this would lead to an economy that will be a little much more informal. And we're already seeing some of that happening going forward than what we have seen in the past. And it's largely because when you are essentially serving a large domestic export market, and the manner of doing that is through large organized enterprises, there is one way of addressing that issue. But when you're trying to serve a domestic market, and a domestic market that is extremely unequal, you might end up with exactly what you see in India, which is a production level that meets every price quality continuum. So you get very low quality, low price goods, and very high quality, high price goods. And within that low quality, low price story, there's going to be a lot of informality in the process. And that sort of leads to Dikashan's focus on street vendors and other such activities which previously were not so looked upon as appropriate in China. Which only then leads us to believe that, there's that much more that value that would add by looking at China and India together. So with those words, I think I will reiterate the fact that this has been an extremely rich conference and something that we at CPR are privileged to be partners of. And a big thanks to the whole team behind the conference. I can see that Ravi is and Rityusha has put in, and I'll just sort of add our own and CPR's word of thanks for the organization team for not only conducting this conference, but conducting it so efficiently and so much to time. So thank you, and it was a privilege being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Your remarks highlighted some very significant aspects and in summary of the entire conference. So thank you so much for that. And I think with this we mark, might I say, a very successful ending of the first conference on domestic governance. I express my sincere gratitude to all of our chairs, discussants, and paper presenters for their insights and for patiently addressing the questions and comments posed by the audience. I also express my sincere gratitude to the audience for interacting with the speakers and for tuning in to the conference. I'm also grateful to the conveners of our various panels for their guidance and support, and for the speakers at our inaugural and concluding sessions for their very insightful remarks. Finally, I heartfully thank the teams at ICS and CPR for all the hard work and sincere effort they have put in making the first CDG a success. Please look out for the edited compilation of papers this conference shall finally culminate in. So thank you. Please stay safe and have a good day ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great team, great conference. Thank you.